Our text this morning is this charming account of Moses being put in a basket and laid into the Nile River, and how he is rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. And even though God is really not a part of this story, he's over it all. And certain things happen that are known in retrospect. It's kind of like our lives. We go through things and then we look back and we realize that maybe God was doing all of that. Maybe he was, in fact, the guarding hand over everything that we had gone through, especially in a time of crisis. But this is the story of, well, you know the story, Pharaoh, who is unnamed, and he never gets a name. And we don't know the name of Pharaoh except that we've done some archaeology and we come up with his name. But Pharaoh, who had no memory of Joseph, Pharaoh who had no appreciation for history, Pharaoh who thought everything resided within him. If you have no memory, you have no future. If you have no memory, you have no fear, as opposed to the women who fear God. Hear the word of God as it comes to us from the book of Exodus. Then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. When you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. But because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live too. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives. Why have you done this? He demanded. Why have you allowed the boys to live? Well, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, the midwives replied. They are more vigorous and have their babies so quickly that we cannot get there in time. So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River, but you may let the girls live. About this time, a man and woman from the tribe of Levi got married. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby and kept him hidden for 3 months. When she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the banks of the Nile River. The baby's sister then stood at a different distance, watching to see what would happen to him. Soon Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe at the river. Her attendants walked along the river bank. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it for her. When the princess opened it, she saw the baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then the baby's sister approached the princess. "Should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" she asked. "Yes, do," the princess replied. So the girl went and called the baby's mother. "Take this baby and nurse him for me," the princess told the baby's mother. "I will pay you for your help." So the woman took her baby home and nursed him. Later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, "I lifted him out of the water." May God add his understanding to this hearing of his word. Many of you are familiar with Oswald Chambers, who wrote a famous devotional called My Utmost for His Highest. But he has this to say about the fear of God. The remarkable thing about God is that when you fear God, you fear nothing else. Whereas if you do not fear God, you fear everything else. If you fear God, you fear nothing. If you don't fear God, you fear everything. The Pharaoh has no fear of God. This one who has no memory, no appreciation, has no fear of God, and therefore he fears everything. He fears little babies. He fears the very people whom he is oppressing. He fears those who have no power around him. And he puts out this stupid order to the midwives of Egypt that when a little baby boy is born, they are to kill the baby. Well, the midwives, while the Pharaoh has no name, the midwives are given names. Shiphrah and Puah. In all likelihood, these are Egyptian women, for they speak of the other as the Hebrews. In all likelihood, they are women who have existed in this larger community among the Hebrew people and know them. And they cannot bring themselves, because they fear God, to do that which is against all nature. And that is, you don't do that. Little child is born, you don't kill that child. And the people of God, coming out of their experience in Canaan, lived among some of the Canaanite people who had what was called the sacrifice to Moloch, and that sacrifice was child sacrifice. And it was, to the people of God, to the Hebrew people, it was an abhorrent practice. And it was against everything that was natural. The natural thing is to simply love those weak, helpless ones as they come into our midst. And so, Puah and Shiphrah, in fearing God and in not obeying what the Pharaoh said, were called by Pharaoh to come into his presence. I'm sure they had some fear then, as they stood before Pharaoh, this awful man. And they said, well, these Hebrew people are so vigorous, they're so rigorous. The word that they use is a word that can also be translated as animals. Oh, these Hebrews, they're animals. And they give birth so quickly, and they're up and back to work again. So this is exactly the kind of stuff something like Pharaoh wanted to hear. And so he let them go. The contrast between Pharaoh, who has no name, and these midwives who are remembered, is the difference between positional power and personal power. Those with positional power, if they maintain a sense of humility, if they maintain a sense of accountability, that they are accountable to God, they're accountable to people, they're accountable to their responsibilities, then their position becomes meaningless and irrelevant to them. But if they have no sense of humility, no sense of accountability, no sense of fear, then it's all about them. And they do whatever they want to do. And personally, they are irrelevant. And personally, they have no power. Since they have no fear of God, they fear everything around them that might in some way be a threat to their position. To their position. Because the position itself is larger than they are. The position defines them. And without that position, they are nothing, and they know it. But then there are these two young women, Shiphrah and Puah. They have no position at all. They're just young women. And for whatever reason, at least up to this point, they've not been able to have children, but they find so much joy in helping other women have their own children. So they're midwives, and they go and they help, and they give birth, and they all laugh, and they see the joy in the faces of parents and family when a child is born. They have no position, but they have power because they are participating in the building of life and community. They're doing those things that constitute some of the most fundamental activities of a human community and family. And that is bringing about life. You know, as we look at the whole story of Exodus, on the one hand, we have the creative powers of God. The power of God to create and to proliferate life. That was the charge to Adam and Eve in the garden, and that is to go and fill the earth. That is the charge to Noah when he comes out of the ark, and that is to proliferate once again and fill the earth. So the intention of God is creational. The intention of God is to make life happen. And that's also natural. The intention of the Pharaoh and those who are acting through him is to limit life, to end life, to do those things that are against God's creative intent. And that is the action of one, ultimately, who is evil. One who would murder, kill. It's difficult to talk about that which is natural, but somehow we know it. These young women fear God, and they know it's unnatural to do what they were being told to do. And we can all argue about what is natural and what is not natural. I don't know if you've ever seen The African Queen. Great movie. One of my favorites. Second only to It's a Wonderful Life. And maybe Sound of Music. I mean, great movies. Well, there's one scene where Rose Thayer and Charlie Allnutt are going down the river toward Lake Victoria in The African Queen. And apparently, Charlie Allnutt has had a little bit too much to drink. And Rose Thayer, who's the sister of a missionary in Africa, chides him. And he says to her, now, you know, it's just natural to have a little bit too much every now and then. And to which Rose Thayer says, nature, Mr. Allnutt, is what we have been put in this world to rise above. So we have that natural sense, that natural self that we will do the wrong thing, but then we have that which is natural, that we know is the right thing. Those things that are creational. We know it's right to affirm the lives of others. We know that murder is wrong. We know it's wrong to lie, to misrepresent the truth. We know this. This is embedded within us. But that's what it means to have fear of God. And that is that we respond to those things that are deeply embedded within us. And even though we may create all kinds of arguments one way or the other about such things, we know. So the baby is saved. And it just so happens that Moses' big sister, who's in the weeds watching as the baby gets picked up by Pharaoh's daughters, maids, and they bring this basket, this precious basket, and certainly the little boy's making some noise in that basket, and they open it up, and here's this little guy. And all these women, these young women standing around, it's that, oh, kind of response that they all make that says, this little baby is so cute, 3 months old. And so up comes little sister. Well, can I find a nurse for you, a wet nurse to take care of this child? And it just so happens that she was there at just the right time. Just so happens she had the courage to go into the court of Pharaoh himself, this evil man, and then to bring the child's mother to be the nursemaid. It just so happens. And though God is not explicitly named, God is behind the scenes. We know He is there. And these women, all of them acting together, are acting, again, creationally in the sense that they are building community. And I don't want this, I hope it doesn't sound sexist, but it seems to me women are more adept at building, at forming and building and creating and enhancing community than men are, especially around the birth of children. I see it all the time with my daughters and daughter-in-law. They all get together with their babies and they go to the parks and they do all these things. Dads are off working or doing whatever. And here are the women who are building and creating community. And it's a beautiful thing. Women are nicer than men are. Women are generally better people than men are. And you know, in the Hebrew mindset, it is no mistake that the woman is the last creation. I like to tell my kids when they were little, everything up to that point was just practice. The woman is the culmination of God's creating work. And the beauty of that is that women then are entrusted with this very blessed act of procreation, this very blessed act of nurture, and then building community. And it's so full of beauty. I was driving through the neighborhood this week, and a bunch of little kids were getting off a bus. And looked like a 5 or 6 year old boy. His parents were there. All the parents are there smiling as these kids get off. He had a little scooter out there. He got on the scooter and then he put a helmet on with spikes on the top. I mean, it was so wonderful, so beautiful. The building of community and how we must live with one another. That we have to live in such a way that we can support and encourage one another. We need each other. And in a sense, the men follow the women's lead. And the men are there to protect and provide and to make sure that the community is intact. That's how we were made. And so the women of this story, it's all the women. The women of this story stand up against the tyrant, against the one who thinks he has all the power, but who has no power at all. The one who thinks he is all things, but he is utterly irrelevant. And under the scene, under the surface, families continue to proliferate. They continue to grow. And the children continue to gain strength and start running around and creating all the ruckus that they do and making life full and happy in Egypt. This affirmation of creation is also an affirmation of community and the importance of our living together and being together. And the importance of recognizing that each and every one of us, even if we have no positional power at all, that positional power is not the relevant power. The personal power is the relevant power. That each of us bear, that each of us bring to one another. And ultimately that power is the power to affirm and to love and to continue to build and to make things well and to make things right. At the end of this month, my daughter, Amy, who lives in Bend, Oregon, they've got 2 little boys. And those little boys are so little boyish that she and James have been talking about number 3, but she says, "Dad, I just know I'm going to have another boy." So they're pausing for a little bit. But at the end of this month, in just a couple weeks, Amy and James are flying for the 3rd time to Salt Lake City. While there, she will be given a particular kind of treatment. She has a dear friend that she went to college with that lives in Spokane. And that friend and her husband have been trying, and haven't been able to have any children. And out of the blue, Amy offered to carry that child for her friend and her college friend. So in a couple weeks, she will be implanted with that which will be the child that will emerge. And I can only picture in my mind the joy that Amy will have in giving birth and then giving that child to those parents who wait with such joy and anticipation. And no, that ain't natural. But how deeply natural that really is. To affirm life, to affirm the work of God in people's lives, and to multiply that life in what ways that are afforded to us. So I'm so proud of her, my goofy little daughter. And that she would share this life, her body, for the sake of another. That's the story of Moses being laid in the reeds. That's what it's really all about. It's about the preciousness of one another. That was just so precious to God, so precious in the life of community, affirming that over against all the forces that would deny that joy to the human community. Will you bow with me in prayer? Oh, dear Lord, with all of the complexities of this life, there are deep and powerful joys that you draw forth when occasion presents. So, Lord, we rejoice with one another in the mere countenance of one another. And the joy that we have is a joy that is found in your Son, who is the fountainhead of all joy, of all life, and of life everlasting. We pray in his name.